Good morning. Hope you are well, obviously, 12 o'clock in the morning. What we're going through gave me a flashback of something which happened almost 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was the first time that I heard the word new normal. Obviously, I'm referring to September 11 incident, a tragedy rather than an incident, where obviously it was the first time where 20 years younger, obviously, almost 20 years younger, I heard the terms new normal. And I couldn't understand what new normal means in the sense that I knew that a tragedy has happened, people has died. There were lots of surrounding a tragedy happening in our faces. But beyond that, I assume that some months will pass and everything becomes to normal. Indeed, it was a new normal which we're still going through almost 20 years later in our traveling, in our way of protecting ourselves, and now in the way we deal with international terrorism. And I think right now, this is another paradigm shift. We're going through COVID-19 is another paradigm shift, another start of a new normal. It's difficult again to assume, because we are as human beings assume that all these things happen sort of, let's let this thing pass and we'll go back to our usual self. But really and truly, the terms new normal, ultimately, it's underpinned by new norms. And the norms that we're going to face in the way we operate, in the way we do business, in the way we interface with our customers, with our people. This is going to be a start, and with the interface of technology, obviously, I think the change is going to be much more accelerated than we even can envisage today. Today, obviously, it's a beginning of a start of webinars that we, Bank of Valletta, in liaison and collaboration with EY, are very pleased to start doing, obviously, and very much cognizant and very much sensitive of the way the economy is shaping up, the way businesses are going through this difficult period, and also, obviously, from a human element, obviously, the way we, as people, have to adapt to the way we interact and we carry on with our personal lives. As you are aware, Bank of Valletta has been very active in coming out as a supportive bank in this challenging time. We have collaborations with the Chamber of Commerce, Chamber of SME, a lot of linkages with audit firms and the business community, obviously, to ensure that what's on offer is easily reachable to the business community. I wish, obviously, here also to introduce Chris Naila, Associate Partner at EY, who will obviously follow my presentation with a very interesting presentation on his end, obviously, on the delving deeper on the new normal. Mine, obviously, will dwell deeper more on the banking element, on the financing element. Chris will take a more wider macroeconomic view of what the new normal should look like. And I'm sure that you're going to find this webinar interesting. Going again to the same point about moving to the next level, I think what we're going to experience are a number of things. As you're already experiencing it, our practices, work practices are changing and changing continuously. What was before, for many businesses still, a bricks and mortar solution, all of a sudden they are realizing that bricks and mortars alone won't be enough in this new world. And so we are seeing employees working from home, use of technology, use of communication practices. And in any case, this is something which we're living in. I don't need to speak much about it. It is the way we are managing to create value. Yet creating value we are. And that is obviously the upside of this surreal world, if I can call it this world, in the sense that that is where entrepreneurship is coming to play, and that is where we're already seeing ways how good entrepreneurs try to renew their value proposition to ensure that their customers, obviously, they can reach out to their customers and obviously strengthen their value chain and value proposition. What has changed, obviously, in this value proposition is that safety and health has become part of the formula. So nowadays, you cannot come out with a value proposition without thinking and taking in consideration the safety and the health, the well-being of the customers who are receiving such goods or services. So all of a sudden, again, we are seeing and witnessing quite a rapid and fast changes in what is being proposed, namely because the reality of this world has changed in a very fast way and in a global manner. And there is obviously a transition period. Consumers are nervous. Consumers aren't willing to fly, obviously, when that will open. Consumers may be a bit nervous to enter into a shop or enter into a taxi or whatever. So everyone, so the business entrepreneurs, they're trying to renew what they're offering and very much cognizant that there's going to be a transitional period until we move to the new norm. And through this transitional period, unfortunately, we are going through fall in demands and fall in the numbers. A big element, and the tourist element so far is out of the formula. Tomorrow, for instance, have a similar webinar with the Gozo Business Chamber, and when it comes to Gozo, for instance, 50% of their economic value added is given by tourism. So you can really appreciate that obviously everyone is going through a difficult period, but when you have concentration of particular sectors, it is even much more difficult. The expat community is still there, but it has shrunk, and to a certain extent, in certain areas, it has shrunk significantly. The leisure industry is what it is, so ultimately, we are seeing a shift in purchasing power, we are seeing a drop in purchasing power, and as you know, when there's a drop in purchasing power, that leads to lack of consumer confidence and lack of expenditure. Having said that, I think Malta, we can consider ourselves lucky till now, in the sense that I think on the big scheme of things, we're doing the right things, and hopefully we'll continue with this trajectory, obviously, to get out of this challenging time relatively unscathed. But I think in all this, and now that is obviously my role in all this, is there are two key elements which needs to ensure that we pass through this new normal, at least in the short term, and get out of it relatively sound. And I think the first key element, the first essential driver, is what we really now need to more than ever prioritize what to spend. Obviously, cost management is always something which should be within our control, something which doesn't depend, like sales, depend on customer patterns, etc., but something which we can influence, not necessarily in the short term, but it's something which we can influence. And I think now more than ever, we really need to prioritize and strategize our cost management in a strategic element. When we talk about cost management, obviously there is the cost of managing our resources, being our people, being our technology, being our infrastructure, being our occupancy cost. And I'm sure that COVID-19, with all its problems, is going to create opportunities to challenge the status quo and come up with new ways and cost-effective ways and probably productive ways how obviously we can prioritize what to spend and spend in a smart way. Obviously, the prioritization should be to ensure also not only a short-term attitude approach, but also a much more long-term approach in the sense that you prioritize on those resources which are really meaningful to you. So if HR is a really meaningful resource to you, in all this, obviously, you should prioritize to ensure that you protect that essential element so that when we go to the new normality, obviously, you can kickstart and be relatively be fast in proposing your value-added activities faster than your competition. Another challenge, obviously, and that's why I'm here, is how to source funding, in the sense that it is good to prioritize what to spend, but ultimately you need liquidity, and you need to find ways how to tap liquidity in these uncertain times where really and truly, and I cannot not be honest about this, banks are nervous. Why are banks nervous? Because obviously what is about risk about the world of uncertainty, and if there was a world of uncertainty, it's now. We don't know the end of this, we don't know how we're going to shape, and we don't know how the sectors will evolve and how the business evolution will take place. So obviously that creates nervousness, and that is why governments intervene, and this is why government provides ways and means how to provide tools, obviously, to minimize a bit this risk that the banks are going. As you know, MDB was given the responsibility of managing guarantee by the government. The guarantee was of 350 million, and this was leveraged 2.2 times, so that there is now a fund of 770 million working capital facility earmarked, obviously, to support the business community. The amounts are not small, so really and truly, I think from a value perspective, 770 million should help us to go through this phase within a scenario that we can project and predict. So we're looking at a 6-9 month period. Obviously, beyond that, one has to go back to the drawing board, and according to the situation at the time, needs to take the strategic decisions as needed. But within the short term, when I say short term, 6 to 9 month scenario, I think a 770 million funding is quite sufficient funding. And the scheme, it works in the sense that for every facility, there is a 90% guarantee, in the sense that that every facility includes a 90% guarantee from the government. But then from a portfolio basis, there's a portfolio cap of 50%. What does that mean? In the sense, this is a first loss basis scheme, in the sense that if, say, Bank of Valletta provides a facility of 100 million, out of that 100 million, the first 50 million that goes wrong, the bank can claim up to 90% of each facility, so it's ultimately 45%. Obviously, any incremental losses, that is at the bank's risk and the bank's expense. So obviously, there are three parties who have a stake in this. It is the government through MDB, who is putting on the guarantee. It is the customers themselves who are borrowing, and I need to emphasize that the keyword is borrowing. This is not grant. The borrowing needs to be paid, so everyone needs to be very responsible in approaching this scheme, because ultimately, what is being taken as loan needs to be paid from future profits, because obviously now we are financing costs, we are financing losses to a certain extent, and ultimately there are the banks where for every facility they have 10% stake against the return being 1, 2, or 3%, and obviously that 10% is exposed for every transaction, but more than that, if things will go bad and more than 50% of the portfolio goes out, then the bank needs to dig in its pockets and to support the remaining exposure. The purpose of this facility is to facilitate working capital, and I think it's critical and it's important to keep up the purpose of this facility. This is not a facility for project finance. This is not a facility for capital expenditure. This is a facility earmarked for working capital facility as arising from lack of liquidity coming from COVID-19. So I think once we understand the purpose, everything fits into place. Eligible enterprises, we're talking about SMEs and large enterprises. So basically, all entities are eligible, are business entities eligible under this scheme. And it's positive to know that all sectors are eligible in the scheme. Typically, certain sectors like gaming, transport, agriculture and fisheries, real estate, these typically are excluded. Not this time. This time around, everyone obviously has been impacted by COVID-19 directly or indirectly. And I think it was a positive thing to include all the sectors, which usually they were excluded because of EU regulations. The exclusions are obviously the usual unethical, illegal activities, those which harm the environment, etc., etc. But also, which you need to be very much aware, those which are described as under the GBER rules as undertakings in difficulty. And this comes from the GBER rules of December 2019. Basically, if you have a negative equity or if your negative reserves exceed 50% of your capital, that is obviously you get excluded. So I think the most vulnerable areas that you need to keep watch is the way the capital of an entity has shaped up, and there are strains in the capital of the entity. There could be a reason for a company to be excluded under the scheme. That is something which you check with your banks, obviously, and you can check also online under because there is quite a definition of undertakings in difficulty under GBER rules, and obviously it's all transparent. Another important area, I think, it is what is ultimately is eligible. So what you can claim for, and again, the scheme, and I have to praise this scheme on a number of counts, mostly because, as I said, it's quite eligible from a sector and entity perspective, but it's also quite eligible from a cost perspective. And the more that the system is kept simple, the more the scheme is kept simple, the more obviously people can try to tap on the scheme in a sensible manner, obviously. The most obvious eligible cost is the salaries, and when I talk about salaries, we incorporate NI, we incorporate social costs, etc., social payments, etc., paying employers costs, employers taxation. So anything to do with salaries, obviously, that is an eligible cost. Same goes with lease, rental costs, energy, water bills, fuels. That is another way. The operating cost, which obviously forms part of your working capital. And we're talking about working capital. Again, you have material and stock, for instance. We're seeing now shops being reopened. They might need to stock up for the new reality, and obviously this scheme can help them in stocking up if they are facing certain pressures because of COVID-19. Fees related to cancellation or postponement of contracts, but obviously excluding penalties and other liabilities when related to non-performance of contracts. So the scheme doesn't cover penalties and other liabilities as arising from non-performance of contracts, but any cancellation or postponement fees are covered. The same goes with maintenance costs, and the same goes, this was introduced lately when it comes to listed securities, the interest element of listed securities. Obviously, every bank has its criteria whether it wants to support this scheme or no, and to what extent. But from an eligibility perspective, that these are eligible. I left out for the last the issue about creditors. As I said in my introduction, the purpose of the scheme is working capital finance. So obviously, you expect trade creditors to be included in the scheme, and so they are. Obviously, trade creditors can be part of the eligible cost under the scheme. But what's important, and that the scheme also opens up, and this is a certain deviation from what I said when I talk about working capital facilities. That is, when you have capital creditors that have arisen prior to 2nd April 2020, why 2nd April? Because 2nd April was the date that the European Commission approved the scheme. So any committed facilities or unpaid invoice prior to 2nd April, those are eligible, subject obviously that there's no financing in place for such capital creditors. So if we have capital creditors arising before 2nd April, and there are no banking facilities in place supporting such payments, those are eligible under the scheme. In this case in particular, the scheme entails that you need to provide the physical invoices or electronic invoices. And again, the new normal, when we talk about physical, nowadays we also talk about scanned invoices, at least for the time being. But in essence, what I'm saying is that obviously you need to provide evidence of the scheme. For the others, obviously it is the bank's priority to seek evidence or otherwise, but in the case of capital creditors, investment expenditure, then it is the scheme itself which put an onus on the banks to seek such evidence. Another thing is fiscal expenditure, taxation. The scheme also allows that during the period that you are obviously seeking support, say in the coming 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, whatever, the taxes that fall due obviously are covered with the scheme. What happens when you have tax agreements? When you have tax agreements already in place, the amount that is due in this period is also covered. So you cannot, obviously, if you have a tax agreement covering 5 years, you cannot take out those 5 years and include them in this scheme. But that element of the tax agreement, which falls due within this period, that is eligible. In case you have tax agreements which somehow or other you didn't honor them and you wish to make up in this period through the scheme, you can only go back up to September of 2019. Prior to September, you can, those which are within the scheme, but you didn't pay up, you cannot go back, obviously, beyond September 2019. That is basically the eligible cost. Obviously, more details you can always see from your relationship manager. As regards to loan amounts, the loan amount, banks are entitled to provide, without seeking any authority from the Mother Development Bank, up to 2 million for SMEs and up to 5 million for large corporates. When it comes to higher amounts, and the amounts in exceptional cases, I have to say, because obviously banks, as I said, need to assess the risk, but theoretically and technically, SMEs can go up to 10 million subject to approval of MDB, and corporates can go up to 25 million, again, subject to approval of MDB. And such amounts they don't need to be taken from one particular bank, but the entities can share the exposure among different banks, especially if banks are nervous to provide large tickets to a particular group of customers. Ideally, for every bank you approach, you have different streamlines of revenues and expenditure, because that makes facility easier rather than having one entity trying to, for the same cash flows with different banks, that will create problems. But really and truly, you can approach more than one bank. The only point that I wish to say is that beyond the amounts, there are also another caveat or better amount capping, which you need to be cognizant about. And the amount capping is that when you go, say, for SMEs, let's say you claim 2 million, that 2 million you need also to cover either or of two minimum conditions, and that the amount shouldn't exceed twice last year's wage bill. So obviously, if last year your wage bill was 1 million, and then you can claim up to 2 million, because last year's wage bill 1 million, twice 2 million, so you are entitled to 2 million. If for a reason or another your wage bill was 500,000 or something, so actually you're not entitled, there is the second test. And the second test is that you shouldn't exceed 25% of your last year turnover. So if last year you had a turnover of 10 million, then you're surely covered, because obviously you are entitled to 2.5. And so if you are asking 2 million, then you're truly covered. If both fails, and there's a case, this is an either or scenario, but if both cases, MDB through this scheme also allows for a forward-looking approach. And this approach is sort of a way out, if you call it, for those customers who have a really good justification to seek higher amounts. Basically, if you can properly justify through a self-certification, and the onus now is on the business owner, obviously, to make such justification through self-certification. Obviously, they can ask consultants as much as they like, but ultimately it is they who has to self-certify such request by providing a forward-looking cash flow, a forward-looking projections of the expenditure needed. So in the case of SME, you can look for an 18-month period. If it's a corporate, for a 12-month period, you build up the case there, sort of how much during the 12 months, what is the funding gap that you need. And obviously, if that funding gap is properly justified, you are entitled, subject to the maximum amounts that are highlighted in the sense 10 million for SMEs and 25 million for large corporates. And as I said before, there is the MDB approval if it's up to beyond 2 million for SMEs and beyond 5 million to corporates. So really and truly, the scheme is earmarked to support everyone, every sector, every customer, and every amount subject to these maximum amounts, which are quite material. Needless to say, with two important caveats, that there is a proper assessment of the request, and as I will explain a bit later, ultimately you can prove the feasibility of repayment. These are not money for the grabs. It's very important to understand that this is not a grant. This is something that it's a commitment from the entity, which commitment needs to be paid in better times. And in better times, if you are just financing costs, in better times, you need to keep in mind that you have to repay it back, not from your revenues, but from your revenue margins, because obviously the revenues goes to support the expenses at that time. But beyond that, from your margins, obviously you need to pay back these commitments that you are entering into this period the commitments that you are entering, the cost of being, the cost of survival. As I said, and I have to tell you again, banks will be relatively nervous when it comes to big tickets, because the moment that you have big ticket, as I said, on a portfolio basis, you start having concentration, and if things go wrong, then you are risking the 50% cap that banks have to go through. But ultimately, one has to assess the real needs of the entity. So if the real needs is justified, you should pursue such request. And as I said, one can tap more than one bank, obviously, to make up the amount of funding that is required. From our experience, the majority of the cases are SMEs within the $500,000, $2 million bracket, but obviously there are also corporates who go for higher amounts because obviously their business requires so, when their cost structure requires such higher amounts. As regards to term, the term is, most of the expected term is about 4 years, but you can go up to a maximum of 6 years. Why it's 4 years? Because obviously here we're dealing with working capital, so we expect that working capital that should be obviously addressed, because the working capital drivers request so much. But in any case, as I said, it depends much on the feasibility of repayment, while banks obviously encourage short-term maturities, because the moment the earlier you get over these cost expenditure, the earlier you can go back to the new normality that we are talking about. But as I said, it depends very much on the feasibility of repayment, and you can look into a time span between 4 to 6 years. The time span makes a huge difference because there are guarantee fees attached to the term. MDB, when it sought this state aid requirement, obviously, it sought to seek that there are facilities without any guarantee fees, but the European Union, through its temporary framework, which is supporting economy during COVID-19, it's always a give and take, because ultimately the state is aiding. These are state aid framework, which is an acceptable state, it's a permitted state aid. And so because of the state is giving you something, you need to give something back, and that the giving something back comes in the form of guarantee fees, which differentiate between 4 and 6 years. And there's also differentiation between SMEs and corporates. Why? Because obviously the European Commission always tries to support SMEs because they have much more inherent risk and a higher credit risk. So there is much more support when it comes to guarantee fees, in the sense that they have lower guarantee fees than corporate finance. The long term incorporates an 18 months minimum requirement, so you cannot seek it long term beyond 18 months, but as a maximum, you can opt for a 4-year time frame or a 6-year time frame. It's one choice. Once you choose in it, you can achieve from 4 years to 6 years, because that will be a breach of state aid rules. There's a moratoria of 6 months on capital and interest. You don't need to ask for that. That is given, in the sense that if the facility will come with a 6 months moratorium on capital and interest, but beyond that, you can go up to 12 months on a case-by-case basis. In the case of Bank of Valletta, and we can consider up to 12 months, as I said, on a case-by-case basis, although we are not encouraging it. But if that is the case, then the next 6 months will be only a moratorium on capital, not on interest. But on interest, there is the government scheme of interest rebate. So really and truly, the most pressure will be on the capital repayments. When it comes to security, we are not seeking. The scheme allows for 20% collateral cover as far as possible on a portfolio basis. So 1/5 of our portfolio, we are entitled to seek tangible collateral. We can seek no tangible collateral at all. We can seek a whole 100% tangible collateral, or we can seek 10%. So ultimately, it's on a case-by-case basis. I can say it, and I say it with certain responsibility, that as an institution, we won't be much looking towards seeking tangible collateral. It's all about timing. It's all about putting the money in the economy as fast as possible. But for sure, we will seek what we consider as soft collateral, in the sense, in the form of guarantees, whether being general hypothec guarantees, personal guarantees, pledges, etc., etc. Why? Because obviously we need to put in the formula the commitment of the 3 parties, as I said, banks, customers, and government in all this. This is a shared risk instrument, and when everyone needs to share its commitment into this, while obviously being cognizant of the time factor, and obviously the time to be as fast as possible in these challenging times. Quickly, here are the guarantees. These are obviously in the public domain. MDB did a very good job in the sense that when it comes to it negotiated the second table. Table 2 is the standard guarantees basic across mainland Europe, in the sense that if you go for SME between 5 to 6 years, you need to pay 25 basis points in the first year, 50 basis points 2 to 3 years, and 100 basis points thereafter. When it comes to large companies, it's 50 basis points first year, 1% second and third year, and 2% thereafter. But the MDB, through its negotiations, it managed to give an improved guarantee fees, subject that the term will be on a 4-year basis. So for SMEs, it's 15 basis points, and for large companies, it's 25 basis points first year, 75 second and third, and 150 basis points thereafter. What does this mean ultimately, without going into this? Ultimately means obviously that the cost structure, that the financing costs are mainly driven by 2 elements. The cost of risk, which I have been referring quite some time ago. Obviously, there's the administrative cost to a certain extent, but more importantly, it's the guarantee fee which is going to drive this scheme. As regards to pricing, and here now I need to be a bit parochial and obviously talk on behalf of Bank of Valletta. From our perspective, we issue the pricing matrix. Basically, for the first 2 years, it's at 2.5 fixed rate, wherever you go. For a 4-year or 6 years, the first 2 years are 2.5 fixed rate, and obviously against 2.5% fixed rate, there's a commitment by the government that there's going to be a rebate up to 2.5%, subject that you pay 10 basis points. So ultimately, really and truly, there's going to be a rebate of 2.4%. But over that, for the first 2 years only, because as of state aid rules, the guarantee fee needs to be charged separately through the scheme, obviously, to the tables that I already have highlighted in this previous slide. So the guarantee fee will have to be paid from the 3rd year onwards. The guarantee fee will be absorbed in the pricing, and the pricing won't exceed 3% for corporates up to 5 million, and 2.75 for SMEs up to 5 million as well in the case of 6 years. In the case of 4 years, corporates will be 2.75 and 2.5 for SMEs. Anything above 5 million, however, will attract from the 3rd year a variable rate of 4% over Euribor. So the pricing, I think they are quite acceptable, especially in the first 2 years. It's going to be a very cheap pricing or acceptable pricing. But from the 3rd year, again, the maximum rate will be up to 3% for corporates, inclusive of guarantee fees. But in the first 2 years, it's exclusive of guarantee fees. Documentation, this is very important, and hopefully this will bring almost to a close my intervention. I think when it comes to documentation, please keep in mind 3 basic elements. The first one is that you need to prove the entity size. You have an application, which if you touch base with our relationship managers, emails or whatsoever, or through our generic email, which I'm going to show at the end of the slide, and basically you can contact us, and we'll send you the application form. And in the application form, you clearly to show your entity, whether you're an SME or a corporate. More than that, obviously, the amount justification, and the amount justification comes into by taking a 6 to 8 month period or whatever you feel it's the right time, and from there you build up a case why you need such amount through naturally detailed cash flow. But more importantly, you need to show the repayment feasibility. While repayment feasibility typically is done via projections, and I understand that typically that's the way we do the repayment feasibility. In this case, as you know, the projections, although needed, are so difficult to make up. So I think rather than projections, even if you want to do projections to support, please, I think it's an important element is to look at the stabilized EBITDA pre-COVID, and then obviously through the margin of safety, in the sense through your repayment requirements, you can really and truly have a good feel whether that stabilized EBITDA pre-COVID, if it had to be stressed, whether it still give us the confidence that you are able to repay after the 6 months moratorium and that you are allowed from the business. So I repeat, we need documentation related to the entity size, we will need documentation to justify the amount, and more importantly, we need documentation to justify the repayment feasibility. And like I said, the repayment feasibility, while forecasts are welcome, really and truly, you really need to have something tangible, and the tangible element is the stabilized EBITDA, and then obviously you can stress it as much as you like, just obviously to have some comfort on the margin of safety between the repayments, and if that stabilized EBITDA had to somehow shift downwards, at least in the short term. Basically, this is my last slide because I'm very much conscious of the time element. Ultimately, and this is a message which I'm been passing through, and I really believe in it. Obviously, while borrowing is something that the banks are willing to do. Now I'm speaking obviously, especially on the case of Bank of Valletta. It is very important that there is liquidity in the market, but I think it is a paradigm shift that we need to embrace rather than being afraid of. I think it's an excellent time to reassess our business model. It's an excellent time to challenge past practices which were going to die anyway, but obviously this change, this new norm, will make such acceleration of our assessment of the business model much more needed. We really need to look at the liquidity drivers, the cost drivers, how are we leveraging our value-added activities. We kill loss-making activities, we kill value-destroying activities. I think now it is the time to look back at your business model, and it is the excellent time, obviously, to make the surgical requirements to ensure that your business is sustainable for the new economy, for the new world, to pass the business in the future, hopefully, to your children or whoever, but to have a stronger business model than you had before, despite all these challenges. As I said, I emphasize that obviously we're open to provide you that, but that needs to be paid back. So we really need to make a good assessment of your leverage requirements. And as we're going through, obviously, even now, this company which were over leveraged are those which are more vulnerable. So that is obviously why banks always be preaching about the need for the right leverage size, because in these difficult times, which come obviously sporadic, but when they come, they just hit you. It is where you really realize how much important you have the right debt to equity percentages and ratios. And as I said, obviously, it's so important to review your assets very much tied to the business model, your value proposition, and your assess of your resources. Ultimately, it is very understandable that this new normal is going to instill fear. It will instill fear on everyone. Those who are not afraid are simply, they are lying, because ultimately no one cannot not be afraid when you're dealing with the unknown. But as I said, the good entrepreneurs, and I'm sure that there are quite a number of them listening here, this also creates opportunities for those who are able to see them, for those who are able to leverage on such opportunities. And I truly encourage you to seek such opportunities. And we as Bank of Valletta, obviously, will be more than happy to hear more about such ideas you have, and we'll try to support you as much as possible. These are our contact details. Please do contact us. We're here to help you, and we'll be very happy, despite all the challenges, to be a supportive bank in these difficult times. I thank you.
Thank you, Albert. From my side, good morning. I do remind you that the Q&A section of the webcast is open, so do feel free to put forward any questions. From my side, I will first of all, I'll be speaking about 2 points. So the first question I'll try to answer is whether we overreacted in terms of government, in terms of economies, in terms of society. And secondly, the second point is, if this is going to be the new normal, what's next in terms of economy, but also businesses, also the clients of BOV. So first of all, we talk about 3 phases, 3 steps in the policy response to this pandemic. We've seen the healthcare response, we've seen and are still seeing the economy support strategy, and the BMCA, the BOV MDB COVID Assist Scheme, is part of the economic support strategy, but also we're seeing slowly a shift towards the revival strategy, and I'll mainly obviously focus on 2 and 3. So if one had to map out all the implications or the channels which we're seeing and are still likely to see as we go along in terms of this crisis, it's quite a busy slide. We've tried to map out all the implications, and you can look at them into waves. So the first wave was obviously the health-related aspect. So we had the impact of the disease. Despite the limited data, a number of measures were undertaking, including regulatory lockdown. So over there, immediately impacts on businesses. Second wave, you've had the reactions of the market, but also again from a business point of view, we had companies that had issues related to labor supply, labor productivity because of the lockdowns. In terms of the financial markets, you could see financial investors selling off assets, moving to different types of assets, and increased volatility. Third wave, we've had consumers. So Albert mentioned the reduced consumption spend. Here we have situations where because of the lockdown, you have less interaction. So because of the risk of increased risk of contagion, people do not consume, do not interact, and again, further impacts on our businesses. Fourth wave, you have further supply chain disruptions, what in economics we call self-reinforcing negative feedback loops. So again, a loop which leads to liquidity shortages and potential increased probability of defaults, PDs. So here we're talking about liquidity shortages, and hence why we have schemes such as the BMCA. And just keep in mind, and this really applies to local economy, is that the new nature of interlinkages, the global nature, makes our situation worse because of both the supply chain interactions, global value chain disruptions, but also because we do depend on foreign demand. We do depend on tourism, but also in other areas, we do depend on foreign consumption. So the impacts have been magnified. And further on, you will have fifth wave. Putting all the interactions together, you will see the dotted yellow lines. You have the policy response, both fiscal and monetary. And we'll go into this later on. What I wanted to point out is that, for example, from a financing point of view, from an accounting point of view, if you had to go back into that map and on the left-hand side, just write down the impact, and on the right-hand side, think of the potential valuation implications, there's a whole list. So if it's increased market volatility, you have a number of inputs in our valuations, in our forecast, which are being shocked. So the discount rates, the multiples, cash flow projections, the impacts on them, and actually doing them, how to project. See, we heard about 6 months, 9 months, 18 months. It ends up with various scenarios. Going concern, asset impairments, recognition of some of the fiscal measures into our financial statements, and even the monetary policy measures will have an impact on discount rates. So you might end up in a situation where there's more risk, but some of the items within a discount rate are actually falling. So a lot of inputs here, a lot of items for discussion. And moving on, again, remember my first question was whether we did overreact. Here we have a summary of GDP forecasts. Keep in mind, today is 13th. We tried to update the data as recently as possible, and probably it's already outdated, because even a matter of hours, days at the moment means data is outdated. If you look at the second column, so 2020 forecast, world GDP minus 3%, European Union, let's focus on the Eurozone, quite a wide forecast, and again in negative territory. I think, again, we're used to write down, when having these charts, we write GDP growth rates. This is actually not growth, this is decline in GDP, which is massive. So 7.5 Eurozone, and you notice the first 4 countries, Italy 9%, Spain 8%, massive implications. So did we overreact? The data kind of indicates the shock is already quite massive in terms of forecast, and we will soon see the latest data. You will also notice that in most cases, 2 points. First of all, 19 was a slow year. because we were talking about gradually moving into a slowdown, a recession because of the cycle. And then in 2021, if you had to look at the rates, the percentages at face value, you say, wow, 5%, that's really picking up. But keep in mind, we're talking about percentage over a smaller value. So the numerator is possibly increasing, yes, but the denominator would have shrunk from the previous year. So the 5% needs to be seen in that aspect, in that element. So it is, I would say, normal to see 2021 being higher than 2019 from a maths point of view. There will be a case later on where it's actually the other way around. 2021 is still projected to be lower than 2019, and we'll go into that quite soon. So I did notice over here -3% world GDP, and when comparing, the chart on the left-hand side is slightly dated. You will notice that during the Great Depression, we were talking about 4% GDP reduction. Forecasts for world GDP are already 3%, 3.5 negative. So is it Great Depression 2.0? Did we overreact? This data kind of indicates differently. The table on the right-hand side is also outdated already because of the oil prices. What happened to the oil prices? Another complication to put in the formula. We've had the first time where we've seen oil in negative territory. So the first time that crude oil futures contracts have traded in the negative since the New York Exchange started trading, 1983. And the chart at the bottom shows current drop in oil demand compared to previous recessions. It's already off the charts. Next chart. This is one of the first earliest indications data, actual data we get of the global economy in terms of impacts. So every week we get US unemployment claims. April 19, it was about 0.2 million. Over the last 7 weeks, so over a period of 7 weeks, we've had 3.3 million, then 6.9. These are all cumulative. Then 6.6, 5.2, 4.4, and now 3.8 and 3.2. Total of 33 million. Percentage-wise, it means that from a 1% unemployment rate in the US pre-COVID, economists would call this frictional unemployment, it's gone up to 16%, which is massive. This is US, largest economy in the world. From a market's point of view, we've seen impressive volatility. So obviously, first reaction was for stocks to fall, but then as the Fed and ECB announced a number of measures, then you had investors that went back into certain shares. Clearly, let's say the tech shares are the ones which have seen largest gains, but the whole point here is volatility, high volatility, US and Europe. And moving on to Malta, notice the story here. So the third column is the actuals. We had GDP growth of 4.4 and unemployment 3.4, which is really low. And notice that you have a number of entities issuing forecasts, and we've organized them in a consecutive way. So the first one to come out was Oxford Economics. The last one to come out last week, European Commission and Ministry for Finance, our Ministry for Finance. And you'll notice that as days go by, as weeks go by, the forecasts get worse. So you might say the picture getting clearer, not sure, but the forecasts are getting worse. So from -1.7% and the IMF's, this is IMF, 2.8 negative, we now have 5.9, 5.8, 5.4. And remember what I said about 2021, which is generally, if you think about how forecasts are built, generally should be higher than 2019 if there's a recovery. Notice that our government and Fitch and Moody's are actually saying that 2021 will be worse than pre-COVID, 2019. So this links up to what Albert said about the impact of tourism in Gozo, and I would add Gozo and Malta. So clearly tourism here has a big picture to play. And even, 6% unemployment, doubling of unemployment for such a small island, it's quite a number. So going back to the whole policy response, we've seen IMF coming out with big packages, European Commission, okay, lots of negotiations and lots happening. And here, given we are in a webinar hosted by BOV, I would like to make this point. So we came out of the 2008-2009 recession saying banks are partly to blame, the whole regulation regime being put into force, and we've seen lots and lots of regulations, and now we actually have a reversal. Now we're told, and that is the true story, that the solution is through the banks. The banks are going to provide the necessary liquidity. We're talking about short-term liquidity, medium-term liquidity, which is so necessary at this point in time. Why? Because we've had a switch off of three important elements: demand, supply, and confidence, so future demand and future supply, all at the same time. So liquidity has, cash is the main asset at the moment, and everyone is holding to cash, so liquidity is key. So what has the European Commission and ECB done? It has actually started reversing, or let's say relaxing, some of those regulations it put in place. And this really puts quickly an answer to what I put forward earlier. Did we overreact? I mean, if the ECB and the EC is reversing its policy over the last 6-7 years, it's really an indication that there has been this is a big crisis. We've tried to map out the whole transmission system. In a nutshell, this is telling us that you have fiscal policy and monetary policy at the top. You have the entities that are hurt, obviously the personal customers. You have the SMEs who are on the score, the corporates who are on the score, and various sectors again on the score. And in between, you have the definition of intermediation. So the role of banks to transmit, that's the word, transmit the fiscal and monetary policy tools by government. Some of the fiscal policy obviously transmitted to the sectors directly. So in terms of Malta, we've seen 2 points here. We've seen a big pledge in terms of GDP and the starting point. The starting point is key. It's the second row at the bottom, so debt as a percentage of GDP. You will notice in this chart some large numbers: 99, 174, 133. Those are debt to GDP. So some countries have an amount of debt which is higher than their actual value on an annual basis. In the case of Malta, the story was quite positive. So let's say there should be affordability in terms of support. And we've also seen the BBC come out with this chart with Malta on top. Clearly, there's a small state aspect. So $1 billion over here, $2 billion over here, over our 15 billion has a big impact. And just to remind you and to put things into perspective, there's a whole menu of measures which have been put in place. Today we spoke about number 2 and the interest rate subsidy, which is number 9. So there's also an interest rate subsidy which the government has put in place, but the main focus of the transmission is the second one, the loan guarantees. I'll show you this chart as well, latest data, and I'll give you some perspective. So in Malta we have about 170,000 that work in the private sector full time, and about 50,000 that work in the public sector with government full time, and another 34,000 part time. At this point in time, 93,000, obviously from the private sector, are on this wage supplement scheme. So it's really, again, answers the question, did we overreact? The answer is definitely no. We're talking about 45% of full-time private sector and part-time on the current scheme. And this is in line with what we're seeing in other countries as well. So finalizing my slides over here, first point is that we will need to see a number of protocols into place, and I think the local discussion has already moved on this in this regard. Ignore the dates over here; they're just kind of dummy dates. I think the flow is there, so we'll need to go into again maybe some of the offices reopening in a staggered way. We'll need to go into more, let's say, less risky activities taking place, and then eventually, first you have local travel, and then eventually, I think last point would be international travel. But before we get to that point, there's a whole list of protocols that need to be in place. And in terms of new normal, what we're talking about is new normal in terms of biosecure community, biosecure businesses, and in terms of both your business strategies as SMEs, as corporates, but also in terms of a national strategy, we need to go for more digital, more local, and as a result, because of the two, more resilient. I think what is important over here is the fact that these protocols are there to build confidence. It's like when you have a contingency plan, but now the new normal is the contingency plan in the sense that we need a framework to be able to operate efficiently and effectively, both from a community point of view and a business point of view. And what we've tried to do is map out this process. So if you look at, let's say, the plot, you have the now, the next, and the beyond. The now would talk about shock and restart. The next would talk about continued crisis and slow recovery, and beyond would be the new normal. So we're, I would say, somewhere in between, and we've moved just from responding to two things: adapting and increasing resilience. So we're trying to adapt to the current situation and think of your business as aspects, as some of the strategies you're doing. Clearly, reduction of cost comes into mind, but also enabling customer and ensuring customer access. And most businesses have gone into this new normal of keeping certain customer access ongoing within the current situation. But we've also gone into what I call evaluation or lessons learned mode. So how can I increase my resilience going forward? And it goes from cybersecurity to having a more agile cost base, and workforce flexibility. But beyond, and I think the point is that what Albert mentioned, we need to look back and take some of those lessons and realize they're no longer temporary aspects, but now permanent. It's the reframing. So when we talk about reframing, it is about strategy. So new growth opportunities, redefining purpose in some cases, and notice over there at the top we're saying creating long-term value. It's not just the financial which comes first. It's consumer, human, society, and financial. Let's say all the four stakeholders together in one coalition. Reinventing business solutions, exploring different go-to-market channels, and moving to a full digital enterprise. So notice that when we talk about a framework of resilience, it's the new normal. So learning from these quick lessons, which we had to go through all, and trying to put the pieces together and reframing into a new, let's say, a new puzzle, which still works. So now, next, and beyond. Over at the end, you will also see a number of, let's say, checklist points, which we open up over here. So going from supply chain, talent, customer and brand, financial aspects and investors, of your relationship with the bank, risk aspects, government and public policy. So to close off, we're saying that we've seen a major economic shock, and whether we did overreact or not, I don't think it's a no-brainer. We didn't overreact as an economy, as a country. The impacts are clearly massive, and we are seeing similarities with the last recession, but it is going beyond. So think of not just the negative growth rates we've seen being projected, but the large volatility, but the high unemployment, the lost potential, and we will end up with a situation where there will be inevitably increased leverage. So the relationship with the bank, the transparency of a company in terms of financials, in terms of strategy with the bank, will be key. We are likely to see more fiscal and monetary measures being taken place because of the need for liquidity in this period of time. I do notice that there are some questions. Here are our contact details. Let me just, as Natalie mentioned, we will be able to reply afterwards, but in the meantime, let me just check if there are some which we can go through now. Albert, there's a question. I don't know if if we do have the time. It says, can you please clarify a point regarding the plan you have just explained? The interest rate for this short-term loan is composed of 2.5%, then additional rate. So the interest point.
Very quickly, sort of, because obviously of the time element. As I said, whenever you approach the bank, whether you're going to go for a 4-year or a 6-year basis, the first 2 years are fixed at 2.5%. So in that case, you're going to pay 2.5%. You're going to receive a rebate, subject obviously of what has the government said of 2.4%. So basically, your cost is going to be 10 basis points, 0.1%. But then over and above, you need to pay for the first 2 years the guarantee fee. I have shown the guarantee fee in simple terms. If you're an SME over 4 years, it's 15 basis points, so it will cost you 25 basis points for the first 2 years. If you go for a 6-year period, it's 25 basis points for the first year and 50 basis points for the second year, and you need to adopt 10 basis points. And obviously for corporates, there are these rates of which Natalie has included when it comes to 25 basis points and 50 basis points for SME, as I said, over 6 years. For large companies, it starts with 25 and 75 basis points on a 4-year period and 50 and 1% over a 6-year period. What does that mean? It means that on the first 2 years, those are the fees that you're going to pay plus 10 basis points. From third year onwards, depending on which matrix you have chosen, so if it's an SME, it is you'll then going forward over 4 years, you're going to pay 2.5% thereafter. If you're a SME over 6 years, you're going to pay 2.75 thereafter. If you are a large corporate over 4 years, you're going to pay 2.75 thereafter. If you're a large company over 6 years, you're going to pay 3% thereafter. These amounts are strictly up to 5 million, and think above 5 million, then after the third year, a 4% rate will come into play. Just a last point beyond pricing, I wish to emphasize that obviously this is, although there is a government guarantee, but I need to emphasize that obviously the Model Development Bank will have all the bank's rights if things go north. In the sense, while the government guarantee will be claimed, then the Model Development Bank will enter in the bank's shoes, and obviously any guarantees that you have provided to the bank or whatever, obviously that could be claimed upon to settle the facility. I'm ending up, I hate ending up with this note, but I really want to emphasize that ultimately everyone is here trying to support the economy and going through forward, but ultimately these are taxpayers' money. So while the government is willing obviously to spend to support, very much in line obviously with what Chris has rightly provided as the big picture of what's happening globally. But then obviously one needs also to understand and appreciate that their obligations, and we as a bank have a huge responsibility to ensure that you are not over-committed, but you also have a huge responsibility to ensure that what you're committing for is something that at the end of the day, with the knowledge you have today, you can obviously meet such obligations.
Thank you, Albert. And to close off, I'll just remind you that there will be other webinars, and we'll focus on other related topics such as cash flow management, financial planning, financial reporting, or effective workforce management, and let's say practical tips. We thank you for your attention. We remind you that the slides will be provided, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.